I drove 7.5 hours to get on a horse, to get up a mountain, to see these bison. Because I love them. Here's why. I mean, to put it simply, I really love megafauna. Giant animals are really fascinating to me, especially when they're herbivores. And they're really fascinating to watch. So, a couple months ago, I was studying zoological illustration, and bison just really got me. They have these massive spinous processes and then these giant muscles that connect them to the head to help them lean down and graze. They have a giant, fluffy body that stands on these teeny tiny little hooves, but they can still gallop and play and fight on them. So if you're North American, bison probably ring a bell to you, as well as a really complicated story between them and humans. And you can really divide the history of bison into before and after people got heavily involved. Originally, way back 45 million years ago, even-toed hoofed mammals first appeared. Then, less way back, 2 million years ago, the bison genus originated in Asia. So they came to North America through what is today Russia to Alaska. There used to be land connecting the two called the Bering Land Bridge. So multiple subspecies of bison took this journey in the Pleistocene epoch, but then at the end of the era, nearly all bison went extinct, along with most other megafauna as well. So as far as scientists can tell, the bison priscus is where it all started for modern North American bison. So from priscus involved bison latifrons and then bison antiquus. And some believe there was an intermediary between the two called bison occidentalis. And then finally, the funniest Latin name is bison. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's the bison that we know today, the bison of bison. There are also two regional subspecies of bison, pretty self-explanatory, the plains bison and the wood bison. On my trip, I saw wood bison. They're a little bit larger, they have darker colors, and their fur has less of a harsh boundary between that really thick part around their head and their body in the summer. Before the 19th century, historical accounts suggest that there were around 60 million bison in North America. More conservative estimates point to around 25 million, but still a massive amount. For a little perspective, there's a quote from one man from the Hudson's Bay Company. They blackened the whole country. The compact moving masses covered it so that not a glimpse of green grass could be seen. The earth trembled day and night as they moved in billow-like battalions over the undulations of the plains. I hope that guy is a writer. That's pretty good. And then just 100 years later, there were about 1,000 bison left in all of North America. Why? Europeans. There's a lot of contributing factors to this massive population decline, but it boils down to 2 points. European cattle brought over by settlers introduced a world of new diseases for bison that they were not evolved to fight. And then these cows were also huge competition for the bison in terms of grazing. Not to mention that a huge amount of the land previously just for bison was fenced off and turned into farmland. 2, hunting. Now, this one has 2 subpoints because there were a lot of reasons why Europeans started to hunt bison. One reason was because it was fun and profitable and they weren't thinking about the consequences. Bison hides and furs were really hot commodities. A single company in the 1870s could trade around 250,000 hides in a single year. Bison tongue were also considered a delicacy, and there were some prime cuts of meat, but a lot of the rest of it was not considered high value, so sometimes a bison would be killed and a fraction of it would actually be harvested and used. Sometimes even the only things taken from it would be the tongue and the hide. So you think about killing one of these massive animals and it feeds one person and clothes one person, and that's the only value you get from it. You would have to kill a lot of them to sustain that as an eating and dressing practice. There's also a lot of reports of parties involving the army taking businessmen and Russian czars out to hunt bison for sport. There was a party in 1871 in Fort McPherson that killed over 600 buffalo over the course of a few days, and they really only kept the tongues and choice cuts of meat. And then the second reason was because buffalo were really valuable as a resource to many Native Americans. Not only was it a reliable source of food, fur, bone, but bison were and are a key figure in a lot of Native American religion and ceremony. So in the middle of conflict between the Europeans and the Native Americans, excessive hunting of bison was a really convenient way to force Native Americans to rely on the settlers' agricultural practices and undermine their cultural and religious values. And that puts colonialists in a really huge position of power and leverage. There's actually multiple accounts of military officials discussing and encouraging the hunting of bison for this specific reason. I have my notes here off screen if that makes sense why I'm gesturing to this when I'm talking about quotes. American Colonel Richard Irving Dodge once advised a hunter who was kind of upset over killing a bison, quote, "A dead bison is an Indian gone." In the same year, up in Canada, the director of the Geological Survey, Dr. Alfred R.C. Selwyn, wrote, quote, "The discontent and uneasiness at present prevailing among the Indians is almost entirely a question of the future supply of food. The extermination of the buffalo means starvation and death." In the same year again, the Secretary of the Interiors in the United States wrote that the civilization of the Indians was impossible while the buffalo remained on the plains. Civilization meaning making Christian, basically. And up in Canada, empty promises of bison preservation efforts was part of the reason that First Nation leaders ended up agreeing to give Canada their land in Treaty 6. And bison skeletons from all of this hunting ended up being collected and used for farming fertilizer. So it's just this big rolling snowball of killing bison and colonialists in the worst way possible, reaping the rewards. They get to farm, they have less competition. It's a terrible, perfect plan. But reaping the rewards in the grand scheme of things was a very short-term plan. Let's go back to my trip for a sec. Here's the forest outside of the bison reserve. It's pretty dense. It was mid-October in Quebec, so the leaves are falling and fully covering the ground, and most of it's orange, yellow, red. There's a little bit of green still, but not too much. And here within the bison enclosure, it's completely different. There's a solid but really thin layer of bright green grass, and there's almost no trees. I asked the guide on our tour, and they didn't do any clear cutting of this area or planting of specific grasses. This is all work of this really small herd over the course of about 25 or so years. The enclosure is quite big, and it extends to the left more into forested area, but this is where they like to hang out the most. And their ability to change all of this area is what makes them a keystone species. This enclosure is a perfect example of what that means. As a single species, the bison can influence an entire ecosystem just by existing. Their influence basically boils down to three things: what goes in, what goes out, and what they do in the meantime. So bison are generalist foragers, which means that they eat a really wide variety of plants, but they especially like grasses. This is what causes this green carpet on this field in Quebec. The bison have prevented anything from overgrowing, which also means that no one species of grass has had the chance to crowd out another. In keeping the plants low to the ground, the bison have promoted photosynthesis as well. There's no shady areas where some grasses would get less sun than others, and because of that, they can grow really strong and really fast. And growing fast means that the bison can eat more. Beautiful circle of life. And prairie dogs also really like this short grass because they can see further with nothing like crowding out their vision in front of them. Bison have favorite foods as well. In a pinch, they'll eat like woody plants, but if they can have their pick, they'll pick grasses that have grown in places that were recently on fire. Grass is typically the first thing to grow after a wildfire, so bison flock to these areas. So without bison eating up grasses in an area that's recently been on fire, other plants like trees have a more difficult time establishing themselves because they have this stiff competition with the grasses for sunlight, for water, for nutrients in the soil. And so it takes a really long time without bison for an area to achieve its former biodiversity. And because of their favoritism for certain grasses, they will move from patch to patch in really large areas where they'll jump from their favorite plant to their favorite plant, skipping the rest. And so they create even more biodiversity by making a patchwork out of the prairies. And when that food goes inside the bison, it is still important to the landscape. It hangs out in the bison for like 80 hours. It travels through 4 different stomachs, and then it comes out the other end. 4 stomachs, similar to cows, it lets the bison break down cellulose, which is found in grasses in really high quantities. And it's really hard to digest without 4 stomachs, which is why we don't eat grass, because we have a stupid 1 stomach. And then it comes out the other end, and it's probably even more helpful to the ecosystem now that it's crap. Their urine and feces are really high in nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and magnesium, and those make for fantastic soil nutrients. And insects also flock to bison dung. There can be as many as 300 species of insects in a single bison dropping. Dung beetles are probably the biggest one, most important, and most well known for hanging out in dung. They move the feces into the soil by rolling it into a ball and bringing it into their underground tunnels, which drives the nutrients deeper into the soil. And more dung beetle activity is directly related to better plant growth, which benefits a lot of herbivores like elk and deer. And then other insects lay their eggs directly on the pile. And more insects means more of other animals like reptiles, amphibians, birds, bats. You might be thinking that cows do a lot of really similar stuff, but there are some major differences. So first of all, cows have different food preferences, so they promote different growing patterns in environments like plains and woodlands because they're European animals. But they also don't do this other really important bison activity called wallowing. Here's a video of a bison wallowing. They do it for a variety of reasons. They itch, they shed fur, they are trying to squish bugs that are trying to bite them, and they tend to do it in the same place over and over again. You can see where this bison is wallowing. There's no grass and there's kind of this indent in the ground. You can tell that they probably also like to wallow here and here. Those areas of packed down soil from the bison's weight rolling around is another pocket of biodiversity. The soil is compacted, which promotes the growth of different plants. And if the indent is deep enough and the soil is compact enough, it'll collect water and become this tiny little wetland. Bison also rub up against trees to scratch their itches and shed fur, and sometimes they do that to the extent that they'll knock the tree down. And that's why there's no trees in this patch of land, which circles back to the point about giving the lower plants more sunlight. Without giant herbivores grazing the land, it would simply smother itself. Basically, bison put the landscape in this constant state of flux. It's always shifting and evolving, and it fills it with a diversity of life. Here's a good example. The Karner blue butterfly. It's endangered, but it's thriving in one area in Wisconsin. It's a wildlife area which also happens to have bison. The Karner blue butterfly relies on lupine, which is a beautiful flower, and it's a food source for them and a place for them to lay their eggs. But lupine plants are becoming more and more rare in the northern edges of their range, such as in Wisconsin. The main methods of protecting lupine and promoting its growth are controlled burns, mowing grass, and removing of trees to expose the ground to more sunlight. Sound familiar? In this wildlife area, bison naturally do the job of maintaining 9,150 acres. That would be a year-round task for a team of humans to manage. And if bison can save lupine, which can save butterflies, what's to say that that chain has to end? It doesn't just keep going, saving other animals and other animals. And what's to say that humans aren't somewhere in there, being promoted and made healthy by one thing and passing that on to another thing? Bison today are largely living in enclosures. Now, they're typically huge enclosures. There's one in Banff that's 300,000 acres, but it doesn't compare to the all-out freedom that they had before the 1800s. I mean, their enclosure was North America. Anywhere they could live, they would live. There's biologists who are observing bison in a 25,000 acre enclosure, and they report that the bison are just bouncing off the fences, going as far as they can and as far as they can over and over and over. Today, there's 400,000 bison in all of North America, and only 31,000 of them are completely wild. And while they're no longer on the verge of extinction, even if they had total freedom, they couldn't influence the continent's ecology with the numbers they have now, like they used to. But on the other hand, herds of bison that take days to circumnavigate probably wouldn't be possible with the infrastructure that we've built in North America now. I mean, could you imagine calling in late to work because there's a herd of bison crossing the highway and you won't be able to get there for another 4 days? While bison were being rehabilitated in these enclosures, the world kind of changed without them. Those bigger bison enclosures are actually thanks to a handful of bison enthusiasts in the early 1900s buying and trading bison to develop their own herds. The Pablo Allard herd, for example, was built towards the end of the 19th century from bison local to the area, as well as some purchased from Saskatchewan, Texas, and Kansas. The Canadian government bought half the herd in 1904, and today 80% of all North American bison are its descendants. So these, albeit limited enclosures like in Banff, Elk Island, and the rescues like Kahnawthaki, where I visited, are one of the very few reasons bison still exist. And Kahnawthaki, by the way, I have to give props to for also rescuing the horses used on their tours. I know I rode a horse named Teddy who was rescued from a lab, and that giving these tours to see the bison are part of his daily exercise routine. And I love that for him. So if you get the chance to drive 7.5 hours, ride a horse for 2, and get up a mountain to see some wood bison, do it. Maybe see some other stuff while you're in Mont Tremblant, like eat some poutine, go for a hike or 2, go in the fall. The colors are gorgeous. But mostly, go for the bison.